James Carter Jr. couldn't stop smiling as he walked home from school that Friday afternoon. His debate team had just won the regional championship, and he felt on top of the world. The gold medal tucked safely in his backpack felt like it weighed 100 pounds, a solid reminder of all those late nights practicing arguments and counterarguments until his throat was sore. As he turned the corner onto his street, he pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. $487.23. He'd been saving his allowance and birthday money for months, and now he finally had enough. Tonight was going to be special. He dialed his best friend Anthony's number. "Hey, we're still on for tonight, right? Did you tell Malik and Tina?" "Yeah, everyone's excited," Anthony replied. "But are you sure about this place? Lake Crescent is super fancy. My mom said people wait months for reservations." James smiled to himself. "Don't worry about that. I already made the reservation. Just wear your school blazer and meet me there at 7. What James didn't mention, what he never mentioned to anyone at school, was that Lake Crescent wasn't just any restaurant. 6 months ago, his father Robert Carter had quietly purchased it from the previous owner. His dad was a businessman who believed in letting restaurants run themselves without interference. The best way to know if a place is worth the investment is to see how it operates when nobody knows who's watching, he always said. James walked up the driveway to his house, a modest 2-story in a nice but not flashy neighborhood. His parents had always been careful about appearances. His father grew up with nothing and worked his way up from dishwasher to restaurant owner, and now to a successful entrepreneur with holdings in several high-end establishments. But he never flaunted his wealth, and he taught James the same. "Hey, Dad," James called out as he entered the house. His father was in the kitchen, reading something on his tablet. "There's my champion." Robert looked up with a proud smile. "How does it feel to be the best debate team in the region?" "Pretty good," James admitted, dropping his backpack on a chair. "That's actually why I'm taking the team out tonight. To celebrate." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Oh, where to?" "Lake Crescent," James said casually, watching his father's expression. Robert set down his tablet. "That's quite a choice. Any particular reason?" James shrugged. "The food's supposed to be amazing. And I've been saving up. You know, I could just make a call." Robert started. "No," James cut in firmly. "I want to do this myself, with my own money, like a regular customer." His father studied him for a moment, then nodded with approval. "All right. But you'll let me know how it goes." "I haven't had a chance to eat there myself since the acquisition." "Sure," James promised. "It'll be like having my own secret food critic." He headed upstairs to shower and change, excitement building in his chest. He'd called earlier that week to make the reservation, giving only his first name. He wanted the authentic experience, to be treated like any other customer, not as the owner's son. As he knotted his tie in the mirror, he thought about what this dinner meant. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a chance to experience something special with his friends, to feel grown up and independent. His father had always taught him about the value of hard work and earning your place, and tonight, that's exactly what he planned to do. At 6:30, his mother dropped him off a block from the restaurant. "Have fun, sweetheart," she said, giving him a kiss on the cheek. "You've earned this." James straightened his blazer as he walked toward the restaurant's glowing entrance. Lake Crescent stood tall and proud among the other buildings, its elegant sign illuminated against the darkening sky. Through the windows, he could see white tablecloths, sparkling glassware, and well-dressed diners enjoying their meals. His friends weren't there yet, so he took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy door by himself. The hostess looked up from her podium, her professional smile flickering slightly when she saw him, a young black teenager in a school blazer, standing alone in the entrance of one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but cool. James stood a little straighter. "Yes, I have a reservation for 4 at 7 o'clock. Under the name James." The hostess tapped on her tablet, her red fingernails clicking against the screen. "James, James," she murmured, scrolling through the reservations. Her eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise when she found it. "Yes, here you are. Table for 4 at 7. She glanced at the door behind him. "Will the rest of your party be arriving soon?" "They should be here any minute," James replied, trying to sound confident despite the butterflies in his stomach. The hostess, her name-tag read Deanna, gave him a tight smile. Perhaps you'd like to wait for them in the lobby. I can seat you once everyone arrives. James noticed how other single diners were being seated right away, but before he could say anything, the door opened and his friends walked in. Anthony came first, followed by Tina and Malik. All three wore their school blazers and looked around in awe at the crystal chandeliers and marble floors. "Wow," Tina whispered, leaning close to James. "This place is fancy." Diana's smile remained professionally fixed. "Your party is complete. Follow me, please." They walked through the main dining area, where business people and well-dressed couples sat at tables draped with crisp white tablecloths. A pianist played softly in the corner, the music mingling with the gentle clink of silverware and the murmur of conversation. James noticed how several diners glanced up as they passed, their eyes lingering a beat too long on the four teenagers in school uniforms. Diana led them past all the main tables, around a decorative screen, and into a small alcove near the kitchen doors. The noise from the kitchen was clearly audible here, and the elegant atmosphere of the main dining area felt distant. "Your table," Diana said, gesturing to a small table crammed into the corner. A busboy hurriedly wiped it down and set out water glasses. Malik and Anthony exchanged glances but said nothing as they all sat down. The chairs were close together, making it difficult to move comfortably. "Your server will be with you shortly," Diana said before walking away. "Is it just me?" Malik whispered once she was gone. "Or did she stick us in the worst spot in the entire place?" "It's not just you," Tina replied, shifting in her chair to avoid bumping the wall. "We're practically in the kitchen." James felt a twinge of disappointment. He'd been so excited to treat his friends to somewhere special, and now they were crammed in a corner like an afterthought. But he forced a smile. "Hey, the food is what matters, right? And I've heard it's amazing." A few minutes passed before their waiter appeared. He was a tall man with thinning gray hair and a perpetual frown etched into his face. "I'm Thomas. I'll be your server," he said flatly, not making eye contact with any of them. He dropped 4 menus on the table. "Can I get you started with drinks?" "Just water for now, thanks," James said, noticing that other tables were being offered sparkling water or soft drinks as options. Thomas nodded curtly and left without another word. "Is he mad at us or something?" Anthony asked, opening his menu. "Maybe he's just having a bad day," James suggested, though he couldn't help but notice how Thomas was smiling and chatting with an older couple a few tables away. They opened their menus, and Tina gasped quietly at the prices. "James, are you sure about this? Everything's so expensive." "Don't worry about it," James assured her. "We're celebrating, remember? Order whatever you want." When Thomas returned, they were ready to order. Malik went first, requesting the salmon. Tina ordered pasta, and Anthony chose the chicken dish. When it was James's turn, he looked up at Thomas. "I'll have the filet mignon, medium rare, please." Thomas's eyebrows shot up. "The filet is $75, he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "I'm aware of the price," James replied calmly, though he could feel heat rising to his face. Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then at his friends. "And how will you be paying tonight?" The question hung in the air. James knew other diners weren't being asked this question before they'd even eaten. "I'll be paying with my debit card," he answered, meeting Thomas's gaze. "I see," Thomas said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe James. "Well, I hope there won't be any issues when the check comes." He collected their menus and walked away. Anthony leaned forward. "Did he just—" "Yeah," James cut him off, not wanting to make a scene. "He did." "That's messed up," Malik muttered. "Should we leave? We could go to that burger place down the street instead." James thought about it. Part of him wanted to walk out, to not give this place another dollar of his hard-earned money. But another part, the part that had listened to his father's stories about facing discrimination with dignity, wanted to stay. "No," he said finally, "we're not leaving. We have every right to be here." But as he watched Thomas laughing with other diners while ignoring their table, James reached for his phone. He had a call to make. James excused himself from the table and walked toward the restrooms, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. Finding a quiet corner in the hallway, he leaned against the wall and dialed his father's number. "Hey, son," Robert answered on the second ring. How's the celebration going? James took a deep breath. Not great, Dad. What's wrong? His father's voice immediately sharpened with concern. We're at La Crescent right now, and... James paused, organizing his thoughts. They seated us by the kitchen in the worst spot in the restaurant. Our waiter keeps treating us like we don't belong here. He basically suggested I can't afford to eat here and asked how I was planning to pay before we even got our food. The line went silent for a moment before Robert spoke again, his voice controlled but with an underlying anger. Did you tell them who you are? Who I am? No, James replied quickly. And I don't want to. That's not the point. We shouldn't be treated this way regardless of who my father is. He heard his father sigh deeply on the other end of the line. You're absolutely right, son. No one should be treated that way. Do you want me to come down there? James considered the question carefully. Part of him wanted his father to storm in and put the waiter in his place to see the look on Thomas's face when he realized whose son he had been disrespecting. But another part of him, the part that had watched his father build his business through hard work and dignity, wanted to handle this himself. Not yet, he decided. I want to see how this plays out. But I thought you should know what's happening at your restaurant. I appreciate that, Robert said. You handle it however you think is right. I trust your judgment. But if things get worse, just text me, and I'll be there in 15 minutes. Thanks, Dad, James said, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. And James? His father added before hanging up. I'm proud of you for keeping your cool. That's real strength. James slipped his phone back into his pocket and headed back to the table, where his friends were huddled in conversation. We were just talking, Tina said as he sat down. Maybe we should leave. We don't have to stay here. Yeah, Anthony agreed. This isn't worth it. There are other places we can go that would actually be happy to have us as customers. James looked at his friends' faces, concerned, uncomfortable, and a little angry on his behalf. He thought about what his father had said and what he would do in this situation. No, he said firmly. We're staying. We have every right to be here, and we're going to enjoy our meal. Just then, Thomas appeared with their appetizers, placing them on the table without the descriptions he was giving to other diners. The calamari for Malik, the soup for Tina, the salad for Anthony, and the shrimp cocktail for James, all delivered without a word of explanation or even eye contact. Could we get some more water, please? James asked as Thomas turned to leave. When I get a chance, Thomas replied without looking back. Did you call your dad? Malik whispered once the waiter was out of earshot. James nodded. He offered to come down, but I told him not yet. I want to see how this plays out. What do you mean? Anthony asked, picking at his salad. Well, James said, lowering his voice, I'm watching how this place operates. Who's providing good service and who isn't. How the kitchen timing works. How the staff communicates. My dad always says you can tell a lot about a business by these little details. For the next hour, they ate their main courses, which were admittedly delicious despite the poor service. Thomas continued to ignore their table whenever possible, forgetting to refill their water glasses and responding with thinly veiled impatience whenever they asked for anything. At one point, Tina accidentally knocked over her water glass, and while she was apologizing profusely, Thomas appeared with a towel and muttered just loud enough for them to hear. This is why we don't usually serve children. Throughout it all, James maintained his composure, though he could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface. He watched other servers interacting warmly with their tables while Thomas treated them like unwelcome intruders. He noticed the manager moving through the restaurant, stopping at several tables to check on diners' experiences, but somehow never making it to their corner. What are you going to do? Tina asked as they finished their meals. James dabbed his napkin to his lips and set it on the table. Just wait, he said, a plan forming in his mind. The bill is coming next, and that's when things are going to get interesting. Thomas approached their table with the bill tucked inside a sleek leather folder. A smirk played at the corner of his mouth as he placed it in front of James. Whenever you're ready, he said, his tone suggesting he expected problems. James took the folder and opened it calmly. The total came to $326.75. He could feel Thomas hovering nearby, watching him. Everything looked correct. Thomas asked, not bothering to hide the skepticism in his voice. Yes, everything looks fine, James replied, pulling out his wallet. He removed his debit card, the one his parents had given him for emergencies and special occasions, and placed it in the folder. Thomas snatched it up quickly. "I'll be right back with the card reader." As the waiter walked away, Anthony leaned across the table. "Man, I can't believe how this guy's been treating us all night." "Yeah," Malik agreed. "I've never felt so unwelcome somewhere. It's like he decided we didn't belong here the moment he saw us." Tina nodded. "And did you notice how he treats the other tables? All smiles and 'can I get you anything else?' Meanwhile, we're lucky if he even looks at us when he brings our food." James listened to his friends, taking in their observations that matched his own. He'd been watching Thomas all evening, noting how differently he treated various customers. The older white couples got royal treatment. The middle-aged Asian family got polite, if somewhat less attentive service. But his table of black teenagers was treated like an unwelcome intrusion. Thomas returned with the card reader, placing it in front of James with an expectant look. "Just enter your PIN," he instructed, as if James might not know how to use it. James typed in his PIN confidently. The machine beeped, processed for a moment, and then printed out a receipt. Thomas couldn't hide the flash of surprise that crossed his face when the payment went through without any issues. "Well," Thomas said, recovering quickly, "it seems like you managed this time." He handed James the receipt. "Make sure to leave a tip as well," he added, his tone condescending. James looked at the receipt thoughtfully, then at his friends, who were watching him with curious expressions. He made a decision. "Could I speak with the manager, please?" he asked Thomas. The waiter's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "Is there a problem with your meal?" "No, the food was excellent," James replied evenly. "But I'd still like to speak with the manager." Thomas hesitated, clearly calculating whether he could refuse the request. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "I'll see if she's available." As Thomas walked away, Tina whispered, "What are you doing? Are you going to complain about him?" Anthony asked, looking both worried and excited. James shook his head slightly. "Just wait." A few minutes later, a woman in a tailored suit approached their table. Her name tag read Linda, and she had the polished look of someone in charge. "Good evening," she said, her tone professional but cautious. "I'm Linda Chen, the restaurant manager. I understand you wanted to speak with me." James stood up and extended his hand. "Yes, thank you for coming over. I'm James Carter, and these are my friends Anthony, Tina, and Malik. We came here tonight to celebrate our debate team victory." Linda shook his hand, looking slightly puzzled by his polite manner. She had clearly expected a complaint, not a calm introduction. "We've had an interesting dining experience tonight," James continued, "and I thought you should know about it." He began to calmly describe that evening, from being seated by the kitchen to Thomas's comments about checking his bank balance before ordering. He explained the consistent pattern of poor service, the forgotten water refills, and the general attitude of disdain they'd experienced. As he spoke, Linda's expression changed from professional neutrality to genuine concern. "I'm terribly sorry about your experience," she said when he finished. "This is absolutely not the standard of service we aim to provide at La Crescent." "I understand," James replied. "And I want to be clear that I'm not seeking any compensation or special treatment. But I do think this reflects a larger issue that needs addressing." He glanced at his phone, then back at Linda. "My father always taught me that a good restaurant isn't just about the food, it's about making every guest feel valued." Just as he finished speaking, the front doors of the restaurant opened. A tall, well-dressed man walked in, radiating confidence and authority. Several staff members straightened up noticeably as he passed. Robert Carter had arrived. Linda's eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Carter, I didn't know you were planning to visit tonight." "I wasn't," Robert replied, walking over to their table and placing a hand on James's shoulder. "But my son called earlier, and I thought I should stop by." Thomas, who had been hovering nearby, suddenly went pale. "James," Robert said, turning to his son, "would you like to handle this, or should I?" James looked at his father, then at Linda, and finally at Thomas, whose face had drained of all color. The restaurant had gone noticeably quieter, with nearby diners trying to pretend they weren't watching the drama unfold. "I'd like to handle it," James said after a moment of consideration. Robert nodded, pride evident in his eyes. "The floor is yours, son." James turned to Linda, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. As I was saying, this isn't about getting a free meal or special treatment. It's about respect. He gestured toward Thomas. Your waiter here made assumptions about us from the moment we walked in. He questioned whether we could afford to be here. He provided terrible service. He made us feel unwelcome. Thomas opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but no words came out. The thing is, James continued, none of you knew who my father was. And that's exactly the point. You shouldn't need to know that someone's dad owns the place to treat them with basic respect and dignity. Linda nodded, her expression serious. You're absolutely right, and I apologize sincerely for the way you and your friends were treated tonight. Robert stepped forward. Linda, I'd like to see you in my office tomorrow morning at 9. We need to discuss the service standards at La Crescent. He turned to Thomas. And you, I'd like you there at 8:30. We have some particular matters to discuss. Thomas swallowed hard. Mr. Carter, I didn't know. That's precisely the problem. Robert cut him off. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them properly. Every guest who walks through those doors deserves the same level of service and respect. By now, several other staff members had gathered nearby, watching the scene unfold. James could see the hostess Diana standing a few feet away, looking mortified. Dad, James said quietly, I don't want anyone to lose their job over this. Robert looked surprised. Even after how they treated you? James nodded. I think there's a better way. He turned to address Thomas directly. The food here was excellent. The problem wasn't the cuisine, it was the service. And not just our service, but how I watched you treat different tables differently based on how they looked or how old they were. Thomas lowered his eyes, unable to meet James's gaze. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and do better, James continued. At least, that's what my debate coach always tells us. Robert looked at his son with newfound admiration. What do you suggest, then? James thought for a moment. Maybe Thomas and the rest of the staff could benefit from some training about treating all customers with the same respect, no matter what they look like or how old they are. Linda nodded eagerly, relieved at this unexpected turn. We could absolutely implement a new training program. And James added, maybe you could start offering a special discount night once a month for high school students. Make it more accessible for young people to experience fine dining. Robert smiled, clapping his son on the shoulder. Those are excellent suggestions. Linda, make a note of that. We'll discuss details tomorrow. Thomas, still looking shaken, finally found his voice. Mr. Carter, James, I'm truly sorry for how I treated you and your friends. It was unprofessional and wrong. James studied the waiter's face, trying to determine if his apology was sincere or merely motivated by fear of losing his job. He decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. Thank you for apologizing, James said. I hope you mean it. I do, Thomas insisted, his voice quieter now. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. Robert checked his watch. It's getting late. Your mother will be wondering where we are. He turned to James's friends, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes. Can I offer you all a ride home? As they gathered their things to leave, other diners in the restaurant began to whisper among themselves. James could feel their eyes on him, but the looks were different now. Curious, impressed, even a little awed. Linda approached them as they headed toward the door. James, she said, thank you for bringing this to our attention, and thank you for your kindness in how you handled it. Everyone deserves a second chance, James replied with a small smile. Just make sure you use it well. Outside in the cool night air, Anthony let out a low whistle. Man, that was intense. I can't believe you didn't tell them right away who your dad was. That would have defeated the purpose, James said, walking beside his father toward the parking lot. The point wasn't to get special treatment for myself. It was to point out that everyone deserves to be treated well. Tanner nodded. That's true. But still, the look on that waiter's face when your dad walked in, I'll never forget it. They all laughed, the tension of the evening finally breaking. So, Robert said as they reached his car, did the food at least live up to the hype? The food was amazing, Malik answered honestly. Best I've ever had. Good, Robert replied, unlocking the doors. Because that's the one thing we're not changing about La Crescent. As they drove away from the restaurant, James looked back through the window. He could see Linda gathered with the staff near the entrance, likely already discussing the changes to come. He felt a sense of satisfaction, not because he'd gotten revenge or because someone was in trouble, but because he might have made a difference. "I'm proud of you," Robert said quietly, so only James could hear. Not many people would have handled that situation with such grace. James smiled. "I learned from the best, Dad." And as they drove through the city streets, taking his friends home one by one, James thought about how the evening had turned out so differently than he planned. They'd gone to celebrate a debate victory, but he had a feeling they'd all learned a far more important lesson than anything they'd covered in competition. The next morning, James woke up earlier than usual despite it being a Saturday. The events of the previous night kept replaying in his mind. He got dressed and went downstairs to find his father already at the kitchen table, reading something on his tablet while nursing a cup of coffee. "You're up early," Robert commented, looking up with a smile. James nodded, pouring himself a glass of orange juice. Couldn't really sleep, kept thinking about last night. Having second thoughts, his father asked, setting his tablet down. "No, not exactly." James sat across from his father. "I'm just wondering what's going to happen today. With Thomas and Linda, I mean." Robert took a sip of his coffee. "Well, that meeting is in about." He checked his watch. 2 hours. "Want to come along?" James looked up in surprise. "Really? You'd let me be there?" "It was your idea," Robert pointed out. "And honestly, I think you have more to teach them than I do." An hour later, they were driving to Le Crescent. The restaurant looked different in the daylight, less intimidating somehow. The front doors were locked since they wouldn't open for lunch service until noon, but Robert used his key to let them in. The main dining room was empty and quiet, with chairs turned upside down on tables as the cleaning staff mopped the floors. One of the cleaners looked up in surprise. "Mr. Carter." "Good morning, sir." "Morning, Pete," Robert nodded. "We'll be in the office." They walked through the quiet restaurant to a door marked "Private" at the back. Robert's office was modest but elegant, with a small desk and a few chairs. He rarely used it, preferring to let the restaurant management handle day-to-day operations, but it was perfect for today's meeting. "What are you going to say to them?" James asked as they settled in. Robert leaned back in his chair. "Actually, I think I'll let you take the lead, if you're comfortable with that." Before James could respond, there was a knock at the door. Thomas stood there looking nervous in plain clothes rather than his waiter uniform. His eyes widened slightly when he saw James. "Come in," Robert said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "We're just waiting for Linda." Thomas sat down stiffly, hands folded in his lap. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Mr. Carter, James," Thomas began hesitantly, "I just want to say again how sorry I am about last night. I've been thinking about it all night, and my behavior was inexcusable." James studied the man's face. The arrogance from the previous night was gone, replaced by what seemed like genuine remorse. "Why did you treat us that way?" James asked simply. Thomas looked down at his hands. I've been working in high-end restaurants for 20 years. I guess I developed certain expectations about customers. What they look like, how they act, how much they spend." "You mean prejudices," Robert said flatly. Thomas nodded, unable to meet their eyes. "Yes, and I was wrong. I judged you and your friends the moment you walked in, and I treated you differently because of it." Another knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Linda entered, looking professional but anxious. "Good morning, Mr. Carper, James," she said, taking the remaining seat. "Thomas and I have been discussing last night's incident since the restaurant closed. We'd both want to express our deepest apologies." Robert nodded but looked to James to continue. "I appreciate the apology," James said, "but what I really want to know is what's going to change going forward. Because what happened to us yesterday, it probably wasn't the first time, was it?" Linda and Thomas exchanged uncomfortable glances. "No," Linda admitted. "We've never had a complaint quite like yours, but there have been instances where younger customers or people of color may not have received the same level of service as our typical clientele. And that stops today," Robert said firmly. "Le Crescent is going to be a restaurant that welcomes everyone with the same level of excellence and respect." "I've been thinking about that training program we discussed," James said, leaning forward. What if we brought in experts to talk about unconscious bias? And what if we created clear guidelines for service that apply to every single customer who walks through the door? Linda nodded eagerly. I think that's an excellent idea. We could implement standardized greeting protocols, seating arrangements, and service interactions. And that student discount night? Robert added, let's make it happen. Once a month, we'll offer a Prix Fix menu at a reduced price specifically for young people. It'll help a new generation appreciate fine dining. I'd like to be part of that, Thomas said unexpectedly. Everyone turned to look at him. The training, the student nights, all of it. What happened yesterday opened my eyes to how I've been acting for years without even realizing it. I want to change. James could see his father weighing Thomas's words, trying to determine their sincerity. Everyone deserves a second chance, James reminded his father quietly. Robert nodded slowly. All right, Thomas, you'll get that chance, but I'll be watching closely. One more incident like yesterday, and that's it. Understood, sir, Thomas said, looking relieved. Thank you. Don't thank me, Robert said, nodding toward James. Thank my son. As they wrapped up the meeting, with Linda taking detailed notes about the changes they discussed, James felt a strange mix of emotions. There was still anger about how they'd been treated, but also a sense of satisfaction that something positive might come from it. So, what happens now? James asked as they walked out of the restaurant. Now, Robert said, slinging an arm around his son's shoulders, we implement these changes, not just at Low Crescent, but at all our restaurants. And you, young man, have just earned yourself an official voice in the family business. James looked up in surprise. What do you mean? I mean, Robert explained, that you just showed more business sense and leadership in one evening than most people show in a lifetime. How would you feel about interning with me this summer? Learning the restaurant business from the inside? A slow smile spread across James's face. I'd like that a lot, Dad. As they drove home, James's phone buzzed with texts from his friends, all asking for updates. He smiled as he typed out a response. You guys won't believe what just happened. 3 months later, James stood at the entrance of Low Crescent, greeting guests alongside Diana, who now wore a warm smile instead of the tight, judgmental one he'd first encountered. The restaurant was buzzing with activity, filled with an unusual mix of people for their third monthly youth dining experience. Good evening and welcome to Low Crescent, James said to a group of teenagers who looked just as nervous as he and his friends had that fateful night. We're so glad you could join us tonight. One of the girls in the group, clutching her purse tightly, asked, Are you sure we're dressed okay for this place? It looks really fancy. James smiled reassuringly. You all look perfect. Tonight is about enjoying great food, not worrying about anything else. Let me show you to your table. As he led them through the main dining area, not to a corner by the kitchen, but to a prime spot with a view of the pianist, he caught sight of Thomas serving another table of young diners. The change in the waiter was remarkable. Gone was the disdainful attitude, replaced by genuine attentiveness as he carefully explained menu items to the excited teenagers. The past 3 months had transformed Low Crescent. After that morning meeting, Robert had implemented all the changes they discussed and more. Every staff member had gone through comprehensive training on unconscious bias and inclusive customer service. Thomas, surprisingly, had become one of the most enthusiastic participants, eventually helping to lead sessions for new employees. The monthly youth nights had been James' idea, but had become a community sensation. For one evening each month, the restaurant offered a special 3-course menu at half price, specifically for diners under 21. The program had received coverage in local papers and even a short segment on the evening news. James, his father's voice called from across the restaurant. Robert waved him over to where he was sitting with a well-dressed couple. Come meet Mr. and Mrs. Wilson from the Restaurant Association. James excused himself from the hosting duties and joined his father. So this is the young man behind the youth program, Mr. Wilson said, extending his hand. Your father has been telling us all about it. It's been a team effort, James replied modestly, shaking both their hands. Well, it's impressive, Mrs. Wilson said. We're considering recommending it as a model for other fine dining establishments in the city. Making quality cuisine accessible to young people is exactly the kind of initiative our industry needs. James couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. What had started as a response to discrimination had grown into something much bigger. "If you have a few minutes," Mr. Wilson continued, "we'd love to hear more about how you came up with the idea." James glanced at his father, who nodded encouragingly. "Well," James began, taking a seat, "it actually started with a pretty bad experience I had right here in this restaurant." He told them the story, not with anger or resentment, but as an honest account of what had happened and how it had led to positive change. As he spoke, he noticed Thomas serving a nearby table, and their eyes met briefly. The waiter gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Later that evening, as the restaurant began to quiet down, Tina, Anthony, and Malik stopped by to pick up James. They had plans to catch a movie after his shift ended. "How's the restaurant business treating you?" Tina asked as they waited for him to finish up. "It's been amazing," James admitted. "I never thought I'd be so interested in it, but I'm learning so much. Dad's even talking about helping me start a small cafe of my own someday if I want to." "Look at you," Anthony teased, "from getting insulted by a waiter to becoming a restaurant mogul in 3 months. They all laughed, but Malik's observation was more thoughtful. "Seriously though, it's pretty cool how you turned something negative into all this. Half the kids from school have been here for the youth nights now." As they prepared to leave, Linda approached with Thomas beside her. "James, before you go," she said, "I wanted to share some news. The staff training program you helped develop. We've been invited to present it at the National Restaurant Convention next month. They want to make it a standard for restaurants across the country." Thomas added, "And I've been asked to help present it, to talk about, well, about how perspectives can change." He looked at James directly. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't stood up that night. Thank you." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. James offered his hand, and Thomas shook it firmly. Outside in the warm evening air, James and his friends walked toward the movie theater, talking and laughing about school and plans for the summer. "You know what's weird?" James said suddenly. "If Thomas hadn't been so terrible to us that night, none of this would have happened. The youth nights, the training program, my internship, all of it came from something bad." "That's life, I guess," Tina replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes." As they turned the corner, James looked back at La Crescent, its elegant sign glowing in the evening light. The restaurant looked different to him now, not just as his father's business or a place where he'd been disrespected, but as a symbol of how things could change for the better. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Proud of you, son. See you at home." James smiled and put his phone away, quickening his steps to catch up with his friends. The night ahead was full of possibilities, just like his future, a future that had taken an unexpected turn because of one difficult evening and the choices he'd made in response. Sometimes, he reflected, it wasn't about avoiding bad experiences, but about how you transformed them into something good.